Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in East Texas swamp. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. Let's begin. It was in the spring of 1905 when word began to circulate in the low-lying bayous of deep East Texas, a region of tangled cypress and waterlogged undergrowth. The land in question lay on the fringes of what locals referred to simply as the swamp, a stretch of slow-moving water and moss-draped trees near a small settlement along the fringes of the piney woods of East Texas. According to county ledger entries and marsh patrol reports, the property in question had passed into the hands of a woman known locally as the Bayou widow, Mrs. Margaret Eliza Carraway, widow of a logging foreman who perished in a sawmill accident the year before. The broader region itself had been described in the records tied to East Texas as remote and difficult to police. The woods and wetland of East Texas afforded hidden recesses, and the region's past shows how law enforcement was slow to reach its deepest corners. The Wikipedia entry for East Texas notes that its dense forests and swamps made law and order especially challenging in its earliest decades. On the day of her arrival at her inherited land, the sky was bruised purple, a typical spring thunderstorm advancing from the Gulf. Rain-laden clouds hung low over the swamp, and the water reflected dimly in the dusk. Mrs. Carraway arrived just before sundown, accompanied only by a small wagon of personal belongings and the hired help of a single hand, Jackson "Jack" Fenley, who had come from the neighboring county. The record states simply, Mrs. Carraway took possession of the tract in Little Cypress Bayou precinct, claimant to rights of her late husband's estate. The air was thick, humid, and filled with the hum of insects and the distant cry of an owl. Inside the small single-story house built on stilts and tree platforms, the local Baptist minister, Reverend Samuel Gillis, noted in his diary, "She moved in alone, save the manservant, and I could not help but feel that no prayer group would ever reach that cabin by daylight if trouble came." The cabin backed directly into the swamp. Beyond the raised porch, there was little but thick forest and mirrored water. The windows looked out onto black water crowned with Spanish moss. It was as though the place itself inhaled every last ray of twilight. Residents of the nearby settlement of Greenwood Springs watched the arrival with uneasy curiosity. Mrs. Carraway reportedly greeted them with a polite but distant manner. She rarely attended social functions, and at church she sat alone, her back to the marsh rather than the pews. In conversation, she spoke little of her late husband, beyond noting he died in a fault at the sawmill. Local gossip stated that she had inherited significant sums, though no ledger confirms an amount. What is clear from county court files is that the will transferred the property and the adjoining bayou rights to her name in late 1904. And so the manor by the bayou began its chapter of strange stories. Stay with me for the next segment, where the first incident occurred deep in those crowded waters. By the middle of that summer, the swamp had settled into its usual rhythm. Cicadas by day, frogs by night. But the house on stilts broke that rhythm. People said lights flickered there long after midnight, when the rest of Greenwood Springs slept. Hunters passing through claimed to see lantern glow reflected on the black water, moving too slow and steady to be carried by hand. According to a brief in the Jefferson County Herald dated July 1905, two trappers, brothers named Rufus and Elmer Crane, stopped at the widow Carraway's dock to ask permission to cross her stretch of marsh. The article ends abruptly, reporting only that their flatboat was found adrift near the bend by dawn. Their rifles were still aboard, but the brothers were gone. The constable, J.W. Keating, made note in his log that no sign of struggle nor storm damage appeared. He added, "Water quiet as milk." Mrs. Carraway's statement, preserved in county transcripts, reads in a delicate hand, "I did not see them after sundown. The waters are treacherous this time of year." It was an answer too neat for some. By late August, whispers filled Greenwood's post office and general store. Reverend Gillis mentioned the widow only in passing that autumn, remarking, "Some spirits prefer company only when unseen." The house itself became a point of fear. Children dared each other to walk to the edge of her property. One boy, Silas Boone, swore he heard a woman talking low over the water like she was speaking to it. His mother hushed him, warning that gossip could anger the widow, and a lady who lives that close to the swamp likely knows how to curse it. As the nights lengthened, Jack Fenley, her hired hand, started missing from the sawmill taverns where he'd once spent his pay. When asked, the widow told neighbors he'd gone upriver for work, yet his name never appeared again in payroll ledgers from any nearby mill. That winter, heavy rains came. The bayou rose high enough to swallow fence posts and half the road. A passing drifter reported seeing the widow standing on her porch barefoot, staring into the rising water, holding something wrapped in burlap. When he hailed her, she turned and walked inside without a word. County historian M.L. Harrison, writing decades later while compiling his notes on early East Texas settlements, referred again to the challenges of law enforcement in the swamp. A fact also noted in the East Texas entry on Wikipedia. It explains why so many disappearances of that era went unresolved. The widow's property was among those most often cited in those records, a small footnote to the era's wider isolation. By early 1906, 3 more men were missing: a pelt buyer, a carpenter, and a surveyor. The constable's reports end with a single line: "Investigation suspended until waters recede." None ever did. When spring of 1906 came, it brought clearer skies, but little comfort. The river levels dropped just enough to reveal parts of land that had been hidden all winter. Children fishing near the bend found something strange. A small wooden box, half sunk in silt, filled with what appeared to be bone fragments and buttons. The sheriff's deputy sent it to the county seat, but the box was lost in transit, according to a clerk's note scribbled in margin. The handwriting was shaky, as if the writer wished to be done with it quickly. Meanwhile, the widow Caraway seemed untouched by any of it. She was seen walking into town once a week, buying kerosene, flour, and salt. She paid in cash, spoke little, and walked home alone before dusk. A new hand, a young man named Preston Vale, began appearing around her property. He claimed to have been hired to help mend the roof. A neighbor, Mrs. Alma Greeley, later testified she often heard hammering only after midnight. "He worked by lamplight," she said, and she'd stand by watching from the porch, whispering to him between strikes. By June, Preston too was gone. His mother came down from Tyler to look for him, only to find the swamp swollen again from early summer storms. The house looked empty, she told reporters, but the door was open. Inside smelled of lye and wet earth. That detail made its way into a short column in the Marshall Messenger, which hinted the place was unfit for habitation. Reverend Gillis grew more insistent that the county intervene. His notes from that year still survive in the Greenwood Baptist archives. Either she keeps ghosts as company or she makes them herself. Yet no warrant was issued. Lawmen in that part of East Texas hesitated to wade into the swamp without clear cause. The region's isolation, as noted in the historical overview of East Texas, made investigations perilous and slow. By autumn, the widow's land was nearly surrounded by abandoned homesteads. Those who stayed described odd smells drifting with the morning mist, smoke and something metallic. Livestock refused to graze near the bayou edge. Hunters who entered the marsh heard what they called singing without words, echoing through the cypress trunks at night. One of those hunters, a man named Caleb Boone, returned to town pale and trembling. He told the barkeep she was standing knee-deep in the water, eyes open, but she weren't breathing, just waiting. He refused to hunt again. Soon after, the sheriff finally sent 2 deputies upriver. They reached the widow's cabin near dusk. The front door hung open. Inside, they found a table set for 3, plates dusty, and the faint trace of candle wax hardened mid-drip. No one was home, and no footprints led away. The record ends there, marked "Inspection incomplete due to flooding." And just like that, the Bayou widow vanished, leaving only the swamp to remember her name. Weeks passed before anyone dared return to the property. By late November 1906, cooler weather thinned the insects and curiosity outweighed fear. A small group of locals, Reverend Gillis, the apothecary Mr. Wren, and Deputy Keating, paddled upriver to the Caraway tract. What they found was half swallowed by mud and reeds. The front porch had collapsed into the water, and the walls leaned as though the swamp itself were pulling the house under. Inside, the air was still and sharp with mildew. They discovered ledgers half-soaked near the hearth. One bore faint pencil lines, lists of names and dates. Some matched the missing men. Others had only initials besides small crosses. Keating's later statement, preserved in the courthouse log, reads simply, "Too ruined to confirm contents. Pages disintegrated when lifted. Behind the hearth they noticed boards recently replaced, newer wood darker than the rest. When pried loose, they revealed a hollow space just wide enough for a body to fit. Nothing was inside, only the damp smell of rot and candle soot. The men sealed the place and left before nightfall. None spoke much during the return trip. Reverend Gillis recorded in his diary, 'If there was sin there, it has sunk back into the earth.' By winter, word spread that the widow had been seen further east near Jasper County. A farmer swore she'd approached his barn asking for kerosene and a ride south. When he hesitated, she smiled and disappeared into the pine thicket." Another account from the Sabine Gazette told of a woman matching her description boarding a freight train bound for Beaumont, carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. None could confirm either story. That spring, 1907, surveyors reclaiming the area for a lumber company drained part of the flooded bayou. Beneath one of the stilt foundations, they uncovered a shallow pit containing fragments of bone fabric and a rusted pocket knife engraved with the initials JF, presumed to belong to Jack Fenley, her first hired hand. The coroner, Dr. Horace Leland, wrote in his brief, "Remains consistent with adult male. Conditions suggest burial within 2 years." The file was stamped and archived, then quietly shelved after the sheriff resigned that autumn. During those years, the counties along the East Texas wetlands were changing fast, logging towns rising, railroads cutting through marshland, but the Caraway property stayed untouched. The Wikipedia record for East Texas notes that even as industry advanced, isolated settlements persisted deep within the woods, where law seldom followed. It is perhaps why Mrs. Caraway's story slipped through official memory so easily, dissolving into rumor and silence. By 1908, the cabin had nearly sunk. Fishermen steering past reported seeing lamplight flicker beneath the water, though none dared approach. One man said the light moved, as if someone were still walking through the submerged rooms. The swamp gave no answers, only the slow ripple of water closing over its own secrets. Locals began calling that stretch Widow's Bend. To this day, older maps mark it faintly, a name whispered rather than printed. By 1909, the name Widow's Bend had taken on a life of its own. Few outsiders knew it by its official map title anymore. Travelers along the Sabine River avoided that bend entirely, steering clear of the fog that gathered there, even on bright mornings. Locals swore that when mist rolled too thick, it carried the smell of wood smoke and kerosene, the same scent Mrs. Caraway favored. The county finally declared the land unfit for development. Lumber crews refused to set foot on it, claiming their compasses spun in circles. One crew boss, Harold Dent, reported hearing chains dragging through the cattails, though no man could find their source. His letter to his supervisor still exists in fragments. The ground moans when stepped upon, not mud, not solid, like walking over a buried house. Around this same year, 1909, Professor Alden Worth of the Texas Agricultural and Mechanical College visited the region to study soil conditions. His later article, cited in historical overviews of East Texas, mentioned Widow's Bend in passing, referring to localized subsidence likely caused by decomposing organic deposits. He made no mention of graves, but his team recorded faint traces of human calcium in samples taken near the site. When a journalist asked about it, he laughed, saying, "Half the swamp is made of the dead." Reverend Gillis, now an old man, returned one last time to offer prayers. His notes, yellowed but still legible in the Greenwood archives, described finding remnants of the cabin roof visible through the reeds. He wrote, "Her house remains, though she does not. The water keeps her secret as the church keeps its silence." In town, the story had become part caution, part curse. Young couples dared each other to shout the widow's name across the bayou after dark. Those who did claimed to hear ripples slap back against the banks, as though something unseen moved closer. During a particularly dry spell that autumn, a pair of fishermen anchored near Widow's Bend and found a length of chain hooked to a submerged beam. They pulled until the water frothed, revealing a rusted trunk. Inside were fragments of fabric, a woman's hairpin, and a handful of melted candle ends. The sheriff ordered everything reburied for sanitary reasons. By then, most residents of Greenwood Springs had drifted away. The sawmills closed, the church stood empty, and vines reclaimed the path that once led to the widow's porch. Still, when storms rolled in from the Gulf, lightning would sometimes strike the same patch of water where her cabin once stood. Fishermen said it glowed long after the thunder faded, like a lantern waiting in the dark, calling someone home. The records closed quietly after that. No final sighting, no confession, no arrest. Just the swamp, endless and slow, keeping its stories beneath the moss. By 1910, Widow's Bend had become less a place and more a warning whispered to travelers. The remaining townsfolk treated it like an unspoken border, a line between the known and the forgotten. In the courthouse archives of Jefferson County, there's a short memorandum from that year, noting recurring incidents of trespassers vanishing near the Caraway tract. It lists no names, only dates and initials, as if officials themselves feared speaking them aloud. That same spring, a group of railway surveyors crossed the area to chart a possible spur line toward the Sabine timber yards. One of them, a young draftsman named Henry Lowe, kept a journal that surfaced decades later. In it he wrote, "The marsh is full of small fires at night, no smoke by day. Found posts where no man could set them. Water tastes of rust." His team abandoned the project within a week. The entry ends abruptly, the remaining pages water-stained. Meanwhile, stories about the widow grew wilder. Some said she was seen riding a mule along the old trade path, her dress trailing wet. Others swore she sent letters from a nearby town under another name, Mrs. E. Fenley, perhaps in mockery of the man who vanished. None of these letters have been found, though a single envelope bearing that signature was logged among the Greenwood postal records. Sheriff Keating retired that year and moved west. In a letter to his successor, he warned, "Don't dig near the bend, not even for fence posts. That ground ain't done swallowing." His handwriting faltered toward the end, almost like a tremor of fear had reached through the paper. Around this time, county historian M.L. Harrison began compiling his regional survey, cross-referencing folk accounts with property deeds. His notes mention the Caraway estate briefly. Unresolved matter of missing men, approximately 8 in total. Site now uninhabited. He attributed much of the lore to the isolation typical of East Texas settlements, echoing what modern summaries in the East Texas record also observe, that the swamps bred as much imagination as truth. Still, there were those who refused to dismiss the story as mere imagination. An aging trapper named Eli Boone claimed to have seen the widow's reflection in the Bayou water when no one else was nearby. "She looked right back," he told the newspaperman. "Then the ripples took her face apart." By 1911, the swamp had reclaimed almost everything. Cabin timbers sunk, trails erased, fences half-eaten by vines. But the locals insisted that when fog rose thickest before dawn, you could still hear faint hammering echo through the trees. Some said it was just the shifting of wood beneath the water. Others said it was the sound of the widow rebuilding her home, piece by piece, in the dark. And though the county map no longer marked Widow's Bend, fishermen still left offerings there, coins, bits of cloth, even salt, to keep her asleep, as they put it, and the water quiet. By 1912, the tale of the Bayou widow had crossed county lines, whispered in lumber camps and printed in fragments by traveling papers. Each version changed slightly. Some claimed she'd been seen lighting candles in the shallows, others that her voice carried across the water during thunderstorms. The Marshall Messenger printed a small column titled "The Phantom of Widow's Bend," calling it a story old as the swamp itself. Locals didn't appreciate the attention. Several families who still lived near the water insisted the widow had been real, not a ghost story made for strangers' amusement. That same year, a group of geology students from the University of Texas visited the Sabine wetlands for fieldwork. One of their professors, Dr. Langford, later contributed to a short report about East Texas terrain, archived and referenced in the same historical context found on Wikipedia. His field notes mention discovering timber pilings older than any known settlement, and human traces consistent with domestic living, roughly dated to 1900 to 1910. Though he never mentioned the widow by name, Locals believed he had stumbled upon the remains of her house. By midsummer, a drought struck. The bayou receded further than it had in years, revealing patches of dry ground. A boy named Abram Kell, fishing near the shallows, found what he thought was a sunken beam. When his father pried it up, they uncovered a hollow length of wood sealed with pitch. Inside lay a small glass jar containing what looked like a wedding ring, a key and a folded scrap of paper. The writing had bled away, leaving only faint curves like watermarks. The sheriff collected it, then never mentioned it again. Rumors flared anew, that the widow had buried keepsakes of her victims, or that she'd tried to lock something away beneath the swamp. Some claimed to see her shadow pacing along the bend when the moon was low, her lantern swinging just above the waterline. In Greenwood Springs, the old church bell was stolen that year and never found. Reverend Gillis, bedridden but lucid, remarked to his niece, "She's not gone, child. She's waiting for the right tide." His journal ends there, dated October 1912. A year later, an unmarked grave appeared on the high bank overlooking Widow's Bend. Fresh soil, no cross. The county gravedigger denied knowledge. A flood the following spring washed most of it away, scattering the last markers of where the widow's story began. And yet, as the swamp healed over, people said the frogs never sang there again. Just silence, and the slow hiss of water slipping through reeds like someone whispering a name no one dares repeat. By 1913, Widow's Bend had nearly disappeared beneath new growth. The cypress roots knitted themselves over the water like dark fingers, and reeds towered where porches once stood. Yet despite the swamp's attempts to reclaim it, stories kept surfacing, half memory, half warning. The Jefferson County Chronicle published an article that spring titled "The Vanishing of Greenwood," chronicling the settlement's decline and noting that several deeds, including the Caraway property, had no formal closure. "The line between record and rumor," the editor wrote, "is as thin as the mist over that bend." A few curious travelers continued to test the boundary. One was a photographer from Beaumont, Henry Dole, who set out to capture remnants of the early logging communities. His surviving plate glass negatives, rediscovered decades later in a courthouse attic, show blurred outlines of trees and water. But one image, labeled only "Cabin Remains East Swamp," appeared to contain the faint form of a woman in the background, standing half in shadow. Experts later dismissed it as a motion blur caused by long exposure, yet locals claimed it was the widow herself, unwilling to be forgotten. That summer, 2 hunters went missing. They had been part of a government survey party, mapping floodplains for new levees. Their camp was found intact, rifles still oiled, food half-eaten. The only sign of movement was a single set of footprints leading toward the bend and stopping abruptly at the water's edge. Deputy Morrow, newly assigned to the area, filed the report and concluded, "Likely drowned." But he added a single line beneath, "Water too shallow to conceal 2 men." By autumn, Widow's Bend had regained its hold over local imagination. Travelers refused to pass it after sunset. Fishermen said their nets came back tangled with long strands of hair. The schoolteacher, Miss Eloise Pratt, noted in her letter home that her students speak of a lady by the reeds who hums when fog drifts from the east. Professor Worth, the same academic who had studied East Texas soil years earlier, returned that year for a separate research trip. In a private note later quoted by the county historian, he admitted, "There is a certain gravity to that marsh. One feels watched, as though the land remembers more than it should." His observation, though scientific in tone, echoed what residents had always believed, that the swamp itself had absorbed the widow's story and would not release it. As 1913 drew to a close, a series of unseasonal storms flooded the area once more, covering the bend beneath 6 feet of dark water. When the rains finally stopped, a lone pine stood where her cabin had been, its trunk twisted, half-scorched and hollow. People began leaving coins in its base, calling it the widow's tree. No, one could say when the practice started, only that it continued long after the rest of Greenwood faded from the map. The summer of 1914 brought a strange quiet to East Texas. The nation was turning its gaze overseas as the Great War began, but in the bayous time still crawled. Greenwood Springs was little more than a name whispered by river traders now, the last few cabins rotting on stilts above water that reflected only the sky and the twisted pines. Yet those who lived nearby said the swamp was restless again, lights at night, whispers through cattails, the faint toll of a bell where none remained. A small investigative column appeared that year in the Beaumont Enterprise under the headline, "The Widow's Bend Mystery Revisited." The writer, Samuel K. Braden, claimed to have spent 2 nights in a tent near the old Caraway tract. His article describes a steady knocking sound, measured as though by hand, long after midnight. He found no tracks, no animals, only the smell of wet ash and lilies. Braden wrote that he was warned by locals not to stay a 3rd night. "They said the water keeps count," he added cryptically. In his follow-up notes, Braden cited historical records about the difficulties of maintaining settlements in East Texas, an echo of the same realities described in the regional account, still accessible on Wikipedia. He remarked that isolation, superstition, and environment together breed ghosts faster than graves can hold them. Even so, his report renewed interest among amateur researchers and thrill-seekers. A handful of them visited Widow's Bend that autumn. None vanished, but several returned claiming their compasses refused to work, and that their voices carried strangely across the water. As if another voice was finishing each sentence, one of those visitors, a young surveyor named Daniel Ross, left a diary that ended abruptly after his trip. The final entry, smudged with water stains, reads, "Heard singing from beneath the pine roots. Thought it wind, but it followed me home." The diary was found years later, inside a sealed trunk in his sister's attic. By late 1914, storms returned to the region. Floodwaters rose high enough to submerge the widow's tree, carrying with it the coins that had been left there for luck. When the waters receded weeks later, the coins were gone, but townsfolk reported seeing flashes of metal beneath the mud, like something breathing just under the surface. Reverend Gillis passed away that December. His final sermon, delivered by a neighboring preacher, closed with the words, "Not all widows mourn. Some keep house for the river." After his burial, the church fell silent for good. That winter, ice glazed the swamp's edge for the first time in years. Hunters said the surface cracked in patterns shaped like footprints, small and deliberate, leading nowhere. By spring, when thaw came, the marks had disappeared. But those who remembered said the air smelled faintly of kerosene again, drifting over the bend. By 1915, the Widow's Bend legend had taken firm root in East Texas folklore. The war abroad distracted most, yet the swamp remained unchanged, as if untouched by time. Local soldiers, before shipping off, would stop by the river's edge and toss a coin into the current. For safe return, they said, though the custom had begun long before. Even the newspapers, while covering the war, made room for small side columns about eerie happenings in the Bayou. One such piece, dated August 1915 in the Tyler Daily Courier, mentioned a blue flame seen drifting near Greenwood's ruins. Moving against the wind, Sheriff Morrow, now older and tired of the endless tales, ventured out one final time to see for himself. He brought with him a lantern, a deputy, and a farmer who knew the land. They reached the bend at dusk. The water was unnaturally still, reflecting the dark orange sky like a mirror. The sheriff later wrote in his report, one of the last filed on the matter, "It felt as if we'd walked into a house where everyone had just left, quiet, but heavy with what they'd been doing." They found remnants of the old foundation and something metallic beneath the silt, an iron hook, blackened and twisted, attached to a short chain. Morrow pocketed it, but by the time they returned to town it was gone. Meanwhile, a traveling historian named Clara Whitcomb passed through the region collecting oral histories for her upcoming book, Voices of the Frontier South. In her notes, now preserved in the State Archive, she paraphrased several Greenwood elders who described the widow who made the swamp her husband. One old fisherman told her, "The land took her in," not the other way around. Whitcomb referenced regional topography similar to that outlined in the East Texas entry on Wikipedia today, dense wetlands where isolation birthed more folklore than law. That autumn, another drought came. The waterline receded again, bearing the foundations of the widow's tree. Beneath it, the sheriff's men uncovered another small glass jar, this time containing only a lock of hair and a rusted thimble. The coroner refused to comment. Locals took it as a sign that the swamp was remembering her. By winter, the sound of hammering was heard again, faint, steady, measured, always at midnight. Hunters reported it from miles away, saying it echoed across the bayou like the ring of nails on hollow wood. The last surviving member of the Greenwood congregation claimed to see light burning beneath the water, right where the old cabin had stood. "It looked like someone setting the table again," he said, waiting for guests who never came. As 1915 closed, a final storm swept the area, uprooting what remained of the widow's tree. When the waters settled, nothing marked the bend anymore. Yet people still avoided that stretch, steering wide as if guided by something unseen, something patient and still watching. By 1916, the area surrounding Widow's Bend had faded almost entirely from the county's active maps. The timber companies shifted west, and the railway surveyors stopped drawing lines through swamp country. Greenwood itself had vanished beneath the slow creep of water and vines. Still, stories persisted. A newly assigned county clerk, Joseph Danner, attempted to organize the old property records that year and discovered entire ledgers with pages eaten through by mildew, except for the Caraway file, which remained strangely dry. Inside, he found a slip of paper in unfamiliar handwriting. "The water keeps what it loves." Danner sealed the file again and never spoke of it publicly. That spring, a preacher named Elias Boone led a small revival meeting near the ruins of Greenwood Church. He believed faith might reclaim what fear had left behind. For 3 nights, the congregation sang hymns at the edge of the marsh. On the 4th night, the singing stopped. A sudden gust blew across the water, carrying with it a strong smell of kerosene. When the preacher relit his lantern, he saw ripples forming concentric circles around the old pulpit stone, though no wind followed. Several attendees later described hearing a woman's hum rise and fade with the mist. The revival ended the next day. By midsummer, the Houston Post ran a short feature on unsolved mysteries of the piney woods. Widow's Bend appeared near the top of the list, alongside references to lost oil surveyors and sunken logging camps. The author, Edwin Pace, quoted earlier research by Professor Alden, Worth, and noted how the swamp's soil composition could preserve remains far longer than dry land, a detail consistent with descriptions in historical studies of East Texas. Pace concluded his piece with an unsettling line. Perhaps the widow was not buried in the swamp. Perhaps the swamp was buried in her. Around August, a storm tore through the region, flooding lowlands and scattering debris into the Sabine River. Among what washed ashore near Beaumont were fragments of old furniture, a brass button, and a warped wooden sign still legible beneath algae, Caraway Dock. The sheriff's department stored it briefly, then declared it irrelevant. Yet the next week, 2 deputies swore they heard knocking from the storeroom where it was kept, rhythmic, faint, like someone asking to be let out. By autumn, hunters once again reported strange lights hovering over the bend, this time blue instead of amber. Some said they followed the river's current, drifting slowly against it before fading entirely. Others claimed to hear footsteps on planks, long sunk beneath the water. None stayed to see more. Winter settled early that year, and ice formed along the outer bayou edges. When thaw came, an entire section of the swamp had shifted. Trees bent outward, mud pulled into a wide circle, as though something beneath had briefly stirred. Locals whispered that the widow had turned in her sleep, reminding the living that her story was not finished, only resting. By 1917, the Widow's Bend story had crossed from rumor into reluctant documentation. A traveling ethnographer named Dr. Calvin Rourke arrived in Jefferson County to catalog local folklore for a state-funded study. His handwritten notebooks, still stored in the Austin archives, contain several interviews with aging residents who remembered Greenwood before the swamp consumed it. One woman, Mrs. Greeley, told him plainly, "That widow didn't die. She just learned how to live where we can't follow." Rourke's analysis treated it as psychological residue from isolation, yet he admitted the consistency among accounts was too precise to dismiss. Rourke noted that nearly every witness described light near the waterline, a lantern or glow that never rose higher than a man's chest. In his summary, he referenced early 20th century observations of the East Texas wetlands, much like those preserved in the Wikipedia record for the region, emphasizing how methane gas from decaying vegetation often caused luminous vapors mistaken for ghosts. But even Rourke conceded, no swamp light hums in the key of a woman's voice. By midsummer, he established a temporary camp near Widow's Bend with 2 assistants. For 6 nights, they observed nothing unusual. On the 7th, they reported hearing slow tapping sounds beneath their boat, followed by what they described as muffled breathing under the hull. At dawn, one assistant was gone, his bedroll still dry, his boots neatly placed. Rourke's final note reads, "We came to record memory and found memory recording us." The report ended abruptly there. Locals found his abandoned notebook weeks later, half buried in silt near the bend. County officials retrieved it, but declined to pursue further inquiry, citing insufficient grounds for criminal investigation. Through the remainder of that year, the swamp grew wilder than ever. The reeds reached over a man's height, and egrets nested in the remains of what might once have been fence posts. Travelers said that when fog rose from the east, shapes moved within it, not quite human but deliberate, patient. In December, a cold front froze the outer bayou solid for nearly 2 days. Fishermen walking the ice claimed to see outlines beneath it, timber, furniture, even what looked like a hand pressed against the underside, fingers splayed. When thaw came, everything shifted back into darkness, leaving only ripples that spread for minutes. By the time the new year dawned, the county declared the area officially uninhabitable. Yet people still came, drawn by curiosity, each claiming they'd hear something different. Footsteps, a lullaby, sometimes just the faint click of nails on wood, echoing through water thick as memory. And always, when they turned to leave, the swamp seemed to sigh as though disappointed they hadn't stayed longer. The spring of 1918 brought new eyes to the bend, though few locals approved. With the war still raging overseas, federal engineers began surveying the Sabine River for possible barge routes, aiming to expand inland transport. Among their team was Lieutenant Horace Dale, an officer with a background in hydrology. His field journals, later transcribed for the Corps of Engineers, describe Widow's Bend as a remarkable confluence of stagnant water and unnatural calm. Dale noted that his depth measurements changed without explanation, 10 feet in the morning, 12 by afternoon, even though rainfall had been minimal. On the 3rd day of surveying, one of his men, Corporal James Avery, fell from the skiff while taking readings. Witnesses reported that he struggled for only a moment before disappearing under water, as if the bottom had opened. They dragged hooks for hours, but his body never surfaced. Dale filed the report, calling it a tragic accident. Still, he added a private remark in his margin. "I thought I heard a woman humming, faint but certain, just before the water took him." That summer, heavy storms lashed East Texas. Trees cracked, floodwaters rose, and the old boundaries of Greenwood disappeared again. The Beaumont Enterprise ran a small headline, "Rising Swamp Consumes Former Settlements." It mentioned Widow's Bend briefly, quoting an unnamed official who called it the marsh that will not give. During that same season, a missionary group tried to establish a chapel nearby, hoping to cleanse the area of its reputation. They built a wooden cross from pine logs salvaged along the bank. Within a week, lightning struck the cross clean through, leaving it blackened and split. The group abandoned their effort the next day, declaring, "The ground refuses the holy." By autumn, reports of strange phenomena multiplied. Steamboat pilots on the Sabine swore their compasses swung north whenever they passed the bend. One crew described seeing lanterns deep among the cypress roots, moving in pairs like eyes. None would dock there afterward. Professor Worth's name surfaced again in local correspondence that year, older now, nearly blind, still writing letters to fellow academics. In one note preserved by the Texas Historical Society, he recalled visiting Widow's Bend a decade earlier. He wrote, "That place has a pulse. I felt it beneath my boots then. I suspect it still beats, though slower now." His letter, written just months before his death, cemented the widow's story as more than folklore. It became a case study in the way landscape swallows history. By winter's end, when the engineers returned to complete their survey, the bend had shifted entirely. Channels had closed, new ones opened. The spot where Avery drowned was dry ground, while new pools formed where trees once stood. The men left without finishing, their notes stamped, "Survey incomplete due to instability of terrain." And yet that winter, hunters camped nearby claimed to hear the steady rhythm of hammering again. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more, echoing through the reeds long after the ice had gone. By early 1919, the widow's legend had grown so large that even newspapers in Dallas and New Orleans printed short features about the drowned settlement of Greenwood. Reporters described the area as a labyrinth of water and silence where no wildlife stirred after dusk. Though most dismissed the tale as local superstition, the stories drew curiosity seekers, photographers, poets, even amateur spiritualists hoping to make contact with the woman who would not die. The locals tolerated them for a while, then warned them off when boats began to vanish again. That spring, one such visitor, a young journalist named Evelyn Sutter, traveled by train to Jasper and hired a fisherman to row her toward Widow's Bend. Her surviving diary pages, later discovered in a library donation box, detail her impressions vividly. The swamp feels alive. Every tree looks like it's listening. She camped near the old dock and wrote of hearing footsteps circling the tent at dawn, deliberate and slow. Her guide found the tent empty the next morning, the ground undisturbed, except for a single print leading into the shallows. The county filed no report. The war's end had exhausted everyone's patience for distant tragedies. Meanwhile, the regional papers quoted a statement from a state geologist who dismissed all supernatural claims. He argued that the shifting soil and decaying organic matter produced gas bubbles and light refraction, similar to accounts of will-o'-the-wisps elsewhere. His explanation echoed that in the broader historical record of East Texas, which often linked local myths to natural conditions. Yet even he admitted privately, "It is the only place I have visited where my compass spun with no metallic interference." Throughout that year, the swamp continued to change shape. New water lines appeared and old ones vanished. The remnants of Greenwood Church finally collapsed, leaving only its brick steps visible at low tide. Fishermen began calling those steps the Widow's Stairs, claiming that at night they could see ripples climbing them one by one, as if someone were ascending from below. In autumn, children in the neighboring settlements began carving small wooden figures of a veiled woman and placing them at their doorways for protection. The custom spread quietly until nearly every riverside home had one. Older residents said it wasn't out of fear but respect, so she remembers we're still listening. Toward winter, a final mention of Widow's Bend appeared in the Houston Chronicle. A single paragraph noted that a bright column of fire had been seen rising from the swamp, visible for miles though no trees burned afterward. The paper called it a meteorological oddity. Locals said it was her lantern, lit once more before she disappeared for good. But the swamp did not forget. When the next rain fell, it carried a faint oily sheen, blue like the flame they had seen. And those who passed by claimed the air smelled faintly of soap and smoke, as if someone had just cleaned house. By 1920, the Widow's Bend tale had passed from newsprint into whispered heritage. The younger generation, raised on half-remembered warnings, used it to test courage. Teenagers from nearby Jasper dared each other to row past the bend at midnight, to touch the blackened remains of the widow's tree stump, said to lie just beneath the surface. Few lasted more than a minute before turning back. They claimed the air grew heavy, their lantern flames bending toward the water as if pulled by breath. That same year, a traveling Baptist minister, Reverend Paul Latham, arrived from Shreveport to lay the ghost to rest. He gathered a handful of parishioners and spent 2 nights at the site reading from Scripture. On the 3rd night, his group heard singing, low, mournful, distinctly feminine, echoing across the water. Witnesses said it matched no hymn they knew. Latham ended the vigil at dawn, declaring the land under another covenant. His diary, still held by his descendants, closes with the words, "Even the Lord turned his face away." Meanwhile, Texas newspapers began romanticizing the widow's story, reshaping it into cautionary folklore. The Tyler Daily Courier published an illustrated feature titled Bride of the Bayou, portraying her as a lonely spirit luring men to watery graves. Scholars from the State Normal College criticized the piece as vulgar sensationalism. Yet they admitted the setting, those isolated East Texas wetlands, mirrored the very geography documented in historical overviews of the region. The legend, they said, had become the natural ghost of an unnatural landscape. That summer, workers expanding the river channel uncovered timbers believed to belong to the original caraway cabin. When pulled from the mud, the wood released a sour odor and a shimmer of blue flame that lingered a moment before dying out. The foreman ordered the timbers reburied, remarking, "If she's still in there, best to leave her sleeping." In autumn, a sudden fire swept through dry sections of the swamp, burning for 3 days without touching the central bend. Witnesses swore the flames formed a circle, leaving the water untouched inside. When rain finally came, the surviving trees stood ringed with soot, their trunks reflecting a strange metallic sheen in moonlight. Locals avoided that spot afterward, calling it the Widow's Mirror. By winter's end, the county closed the last road leading into Greenwood's remains. Officially, it was due to flooding and safety hazards, but residents knew better. The swamp had reclaimed what was hers, sealing each trail behind fog and water. And on quiet nights, boatmen along the Sabine still claimed they saw a faint light deep in the marsh, moving slowly, patiently, as though marking a table that had never been cleared. Those who lingered long enough to listen said they heard faint tapping, 5 knocks, then silence, and the whisper of a woman's sigh carried downstream. By 1921, Widow's Bend was less a destination than a caution line on river charts, an empty curve marked unfit for passage. Still, the name persisted in oral tradition. Old-timers swapped versions at taverns and trading posts, claiming each knew the true story of the Bayou widow. Some said she had been seen as far east as Nacogdoches, living under a false name. Others insisted her ghost had merged with the swamp itself, her breath the fog that rolled in before dawn. Whatever truth remained was buried as deeply as the cypress roots that crisscrossed her land. That spring, a county archivist named Franklin Eddins began cataloging forgotten deeds and police reports from Jefferson and Sabine counties. In one of the mold-stained folders marked Caraway, 1905-1908, he found an unsigned affidavit describing excavations yielding small human remains consistent with juveniles. The paper had no official seal, only a faint smudge of blue wax where one should have been. Eddins wrote a brief summary and filed it under disputed claims. Within a month, his notes vanished from the records room. The custodian who replaced him later said he stopped coming to work after mentioning the widow's name out loud. Around midsummer, a young historian from Austin, Miriam Fletcher, traveled to the area to gather material for her thesis on rural superstitions. Her letters home, later printed in a university journal, spoke of an unsettling harmony in the swamp. She described the nights as so still the trees breathe for you. One evening, she reported hearing a knocking sound followed by faint singing that seemed to rise from the water rather than across it. Locals warned her not to linger after sundown. When she returned to town the next morning, she found her boots soaked, though she swore she hadn't stepped near the water. By autumn, a renewed logging effort attempted to reclaim part of the land. Machinery bogged down almost immediately, engines seized without cause, and the men refused to continue after one of their number fell ill, claiming he'd swallowed a mouthful of air that tasted like ashes. Their foreman wrote in frustration, "Every bolt rusts overnight. The ground itself rejects our presence." In the archives of East Texas history, references to the Widow's Bend began dwindling around this period, but not disappearing entirely. Later summaries, much like the one cited in the modern Wikipedia entry on East Texas, still mention persistent local folklore of a vanished settlement, haunted by environmental hazards and rumor. Yet even those accounts carry the same uncertain phrasing, as though the writers, too, feared the subject. By the close of that year, only the oldest residents remembered Greenwood as it once was. They said the swamp had finally finished its meal, pulling under what scraps of memory remained. And though the lantern light no longer flickered as often, a few who traveled by night swore they could still see a shimmer beneath the surface. Not fire, not reflection, but the faint outline of a woman's hand, reaching upward, waiting for someone brave enough to take it. By 1922, time itself seemed to have slowed around Widow's Bend. The swamp was nearly impassable now, overrun with creeping moss, roots like ribs jutting from the soil, and water so still it mirrored the sky without distortion. Even the frogs fell silent there. Hunters said the air at the bend held no echo. That sound itself refused to return. Despite the encroaching wilderness, the place remained marked on survey maps, annotated with faint pencil notes like "Do not dredge" and "Unsettled terrain." That spring, a freight barge detoured through the Sabine due to low water upriver. The captain, Thomas Wayne, later reported in his log seeing a light swinging in the trees, followed by what he called a shadow on the current that kept pace with us. The crew thought it phosphorescent gas, but when they anchored to investigate, the light vanished, and the air filled with the smell of burning pine resin. One deckhand fell overboard and claimed something brushed his ankle, soft as cloth. They left before sunrise, refusing to speak further. Later that year, an elderly clerk named Danner, the same man who'd once found the Caraway file dry amid ruined ledgers, wrote a short letter to the Beaumont Enterprise. It was never printed, but the draft survives in the archive. In it, he warned that too much remembering keeps her near and advised closing the county records on Greenwood for good. He ended with a line that local historians still quote, "Some women bury their past. This one taught the ground to hold it." Meanwhile, Reverend Latham's son, returning from service overseas, visited the region hoping to document his father's accounts. He found nothing but flooded paths and the ruins of an old road swallowed by cattails. Locals told him that when fog settled over the water, voices still rose from beneath, not screaming but murmuring like a prayer half-spoken. He left 2 days later, leaving his father's worn Bible on a stump at the edge of the bayou. A week afterward, a mail carrier discovered that same Bible floating miles downstream, perfectly dry. Throughout the year, scattered reports continued. A fisherman hearing tapping from below his skiff. A child dreaming of a woman who smells like soap and fire. Each story added another thread to the tapestry of legend. County officials dismissed them, but folklore scholars quietly collected every version. One, writing in a regional journal, noted how this myth fit patterns of frontier trauma and isolation, typical of East Texas, just as earlier chroniclers in that region's Wikipedia reference described how environment shaped belief. By winter, the river froze briefly again, trapping dead reeds beneath a glassy sheet. When thaw came, witnesses swore they saw faint circles forming in the meltwater, ripples without wind, widening slowly from a single point at the bend's heart. Some said it was the swamp breathing. Others said she was stirring, restless once more, waiting for her name to be spoken aloud. By 1923, the Widow's Bend had faded almost entirely from official mention, surviving only in whispered recollections and the damp corners of library archives. The Greenwood region, once lively with sawmills and sermons, was now only a memory carried by the few who refused to move inland. The swamp, swollen with decades of rain, had erased most traces of the settlement, yet when the wind cut through the cypress, it still carried faint notes of something human, a hum soft and circular, as though repeating itself endlessly. That spring, a traveling schoolteacher named Hazel Combs boarded with a family near the old ferry crossing. She wrote in her journal that the nights were so quiet, it felt like the world was waiting for a sound that never came. On April 11th, she noted a strange occurrence. "I saw a light under the water. Not reflection. A true glow shaped like a window." She described it in detail, the glow widening, the surface trembling as if something breathed beneath. Her last entry ends mid-sentence. "If this is what they mean by her..." The rest of the page is torn away. That summer, the state's land office made one final survey to determine if Widow's Bend could be reclaimed for navigation. The surveyors found no stable footing, no clear boundary between river and shore. One of them remarked that his depth pole struck something solid only once, like tapping on wood, hollow and waiting. They recorded their findings and withdrew, filing the area as non-viable terrain. In autumn, a mild hurricane pushed inland from the Gulf, flooding the bayous for miles. When the waters retreated, towns along the Sabine discovered hundreds of small objects washed ashore: coins, nails, bits of broken glass, even a brass key etched with the initials MEC. The county clerk recognized the initials immediately, but chose not to log them, writing instead artifacts of uncertain origin. That winter, an old historian named Rourke, the same ethnographer who had once camped near the site, returned to East Texas to see if the legend still lived. He found nothing but fog and the sound of dripping water. In his final letter to the state archive, he wrote, "It is quiet now. She has what she wanted, to be remembered without being found." Today, no trace of Greenwood or the Caraway estate remains, yet locals still warn strangers who drift too close. They say the swamp breathes differently there, slower, deeper, as though guarding something. When the mist gathers just before sunrise, a faint glow appears near the center of the bend, soft, blue, and pulsing like a lantern beneath glass. No one has ever reached it. Those who tried say the water thickens, their paddles grow heavy, and a low voice murmurs from somewhere below. Whether it's wind or something older, none can say. All that endures is the silence that follows, and the name that still carries on the current, the Bayou Widow.